Prantik Banerjee. We are fortunate to have Dr. Prantik Banerjee, Associate Professor, Hislop College, Nagpur, as the keynote speaker of the session, and he'll be probing into the intersection of literature and energy resources in his paper, Petrofiction or Petrification, Narratives of Oil in a Hydrocarbon Age. Dr. Banerjee is an accomplished academician and a much sought after resource person who has delivered lectures in various universities across the length and breadth of the country. He has proved his expertise in the fields of literary theory, culture studies, film and media studies, gerontology, and pandemic narratives. His proficiency and scholarly assertiveness won him various positions such as National Faculty Trainer for IIShe and RUSA, External Advisor to NAC at reputed colleges and universities, an expert member on the drafting committee of NICC's National Higher Education Policy, and member of Board of Studies in various universities. This multi-potentialist personality has many published poems and short stories to his credit. His latest book, Cultural Studies, Texts and Contexts, provides a detailed commentary on the path-breaking writings of cultural theorists like Reynold Williams, Stuart Hall, Walter Benjamin, etc. And this promising book will be of immense help to students, teachers, and researchers alike. Dr. Banerjee, we're extremely delighted and privileged to have you here in our midst today. With due respect and courtesy, may I welcome you, sir, to this online conference and also invite you for the keynote address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am. Yeah. Just checking the systems again. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Fine. Right. So first of all, to begin with, let me express my profuse thanks to Dr. Minnie Abraham, who's been communicating with me, and to the principal and the entire faculty, the staff and students of Bharat Manta College. Also, special thanks to two of my dear friends, Dr. Jai Singh, the organizing secretary, and a co-convener, Dr. Chitra, and also greetings from Hislop College to Dr. Rose Sebastian, the convener of this particular international conference, this online international conference. Thank you so much, and good morning, dear participants. Thank you so much for having me here. Join you all on this platform, and hopefully in the next 90 minutes, I will be able to do what I'm supposed to do. Friends, when I read your the conference brochure, the conference subject, sort of taking up something that might be a little inflammatory and incendiary. I mean, the subject that I'm going to speak on is a rather combustible subject, an inflammatory theme, because it easily fuels extreme passions and ignites very strong reactions from all quarters. I mean, think of what you did recently when you woke up to find in the newspapers the government announcing another hike in petrol price. You probably, like most of us, you also probably dashed off to the nearest petrol pump to tank up a vehicle before the hike in the fuel price burnt another hole, a huge hole in your pocket. Well, if I said that petroleum and its products have saturated, that oil has fueled, that petroleum and oil and energy has driven our lives, it would seem to be stating an obvious truth. I mean, in a documentary, an award-winning documentary, which came out somewhere in the early 2000s, the voiceover, the documentary begins. It's called A Crude Awakening. It's called A Crude Awakening, and the documentary begins with a voiceover saying, "Oil is our God. Oil is our God. We all worship petroleum." So clearly much has happened since Nietzsche announced the death of God. The voiceover of this award-winning documentary, A Crude Awakening, and notice the pun in the title of this documentary, very intelligently and imaginatively imaginatively titled The Word Crude, says that oil is our God. We all are petroleum worshippers. Uh, it is, in fact, undeniable. I mean, there's no gainsaying the fact that our lives are saturated in oil. It is the most significant resource of our modern capitalist, consumerist lifestyle. Indeed, oil is everywhere. I mean, but the strange thing is that even if even if oil is everywhere around us, it is ubiquitous. Yet, strangely enough, or paradoxically enough, it seems uh, rather invisible. Invisible. It oil determines, of course, how and where we live, how we move, how we work, how we play, what we eat, what we wear, what we consume. Uh, to say the least, therefore, that oil has, is heavily invested in the shaping of our political, our economic, and physical landscapes. But to think about oil, friends, is not just to think about automobiles or derricks or spectacular spillovers or even the price of barrels, oil barrels. I mean, think about it. The computer, the laptop, or the smartphone on which you and I are connected today on this platform is in fact made uh, out of a material from, from oil. In fact, without oil, one would say that the well-oiled levers of our world economy, of our world system, would collapse, as is often the case when there is a sharp fall in in the production or in the production of oil, or whenever there is a steep hike in oil prices. So it is no exaggeration to say that our modern culture is a hydrocarbon culture, or that our 21st century culture is a petro culture, is a petro-driven culture. So in a sense that, what I'm trying to bring to your attention is that oil, when we talk about oil makes us not only go in the physical sense as a mode, as something that fuels our modes of transportation, something that makes possible for us to move from one place to another. But more importantly, and this is the central thesis of my talk today, and more importantly, oil and its commodities, its petroleum products are the ones that drive ideas and ideals that define, determine, and shape our modernity. So while it is an obvious truth that as human societies have required energy to function uh, down the ages, it is sort of less recognized that there is a deep connection. There is a deep connection between between energy and culture. Uh, it's not too visible. Oil's discourse or oil's narrative, as it seeps into our lives, as it sort of not only determines our political economies, but also has a profound influence on our social and cultural imaginaries. This is something that is perhaps not too obvious. So deep embedded and invisible is the discourse of oil in relation to culture, in relation to politics, and in relation to society. So this deep connection between oil, literature, culture, and society is the one that has become the site of much interdisciplinary critical inquiry in recent times. Um, so in my talk today, what I propose to do is to examine literature's relation with energy sources from the perspective, from the lens, using the lens of what you might call ecological Marxism, and uncover the not so visible intersections between oil culture and society, and the critical discourses that are embedded within it. So I'm going to run my talk. I'm going to run my talk fueled by some interesting questions for us. Um, is oil is oil simply a material resource, or um, does it possess a cultural capital? How are how are art, culture, and literature? How are the cultural expressions, the imaginative expressions of our capitalist modernity? How are they entwined with the material resources of with the materiality of natural resources of a particular age. What is the relationship? What is the relationship between oil encounter, and that we by that I mean the encounter between oil-rich, for example, the oil-rich global north, or the oil-rich societies, and the and oil-consuming first world societies, or the global north countries. So, I mean, one has to remember that the politics of colonialism, the politics of post-colonialism were and are animated, they continue to be animated by the competitive struggle, to find, to access, and to claim energy resources in different periods of time. So the point, one among the many questions, therefore, that one perceives in the interconnection or the intersection between oil and its influence on culture and society is, for example, that if we examine literature from the oil perspective, then does an inquiry about oil's visibility in literary texts, in literary or cultural texts, for example, how does it change our critical reading practices? Can an energy-driven approach provide the necessary interpretive strategies, or as Said would say, contrapuntal aesthetics, to help us understand how the materiality and worldliness of energy is embedded in literary fiction? Is it possible? Is it even possible to formulate a semiotics of oil? So these are some of the questions that perhaps I will take up, and hopefully the deliberations, or hopefully it will lead to that certain amount of exchange of deliberations. Just a minute. Let me share my screen with you. Do let me know if my screen is visible.
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Right. So this is yeah. So, this particular award-winning documentary, which I said is titled The Crude Awakening, is one that sort of asks this apocalyptic question, or end of oil scenario. What happens when we run? What happens to us as society? What happens to our culture? What happens to our political economy? What happens when we run out of oil? What we once thought the oil reserves to be abundantly rich are, after all, finite resources. So what happens when we run out of oil? And so this is the nightmarish, this is the question, which sort of envisages a nightmarish future that this particular documentary that examines. But before I enter into, enter into this intersection between oil, culture, society, and environment, let me attempt to frame my talk by what we call ecological Marxism. Petroculture, well, this is some of the salient features that probably when we talk about petroculture, when we talk about the 21st century, not just being a postmodern culture, but also one that is defined, that is driven by hydrocarbon, petroleum. Well, Stephanie Limanaga, she is one of the prominent hydrocarbon or energy humanists and critics, and she's the one who says that petroculture is modern culture. And as the slide shows to you, that when we talk about the 21st century society being a petroculture society, then what are its distinguishing features? Some that are prescriptive and normative, and some that are species defining. So deep down, I mean, when we talk about petroculture, we are not talking about oil as merely a material commodity whose physical abundance, at least so far, has sort of enabled us to do what we want. But it is also to examine how oil, in fact, imprints, how oil seeps and imprints its influence on the very ontology of our being, the way we live, the way we imagine, the way we create, the way we produce, everything seems to be um, uh, uh, connected, deeply connected, or deeply meshed by the narratives of oil, or should I say, the pipelines of oil. So before I do that, I mean, traditional or conventional Marxism, we all do theory in our classrooms, and we do talk about Marxist approaches to literature. But in recent times, there has been the emergence of a new approach where ecology or questions of deep ecology or environment is sort of married to Marxist theory. And so ecological Marxism is a sort of is the application of the ideas of Karl Marx to the study and analysis of nature and its resources, resources such as oil, coal, tar, um, spices. All of these, as are as a typical Marxist approach would be, all of them are considered as a capital commodity, something that fuels and charges and energizes not only political economy but also sort of directs and influences the social relationships between labor and capital. So one would say that ecological Marxism is based on the fundamental premise, the Marxist premise, that the problem of nature is a problem of capital. Uh, when we read Marx, whether it is particularly his seminal work, Capital, Marx developed a theory of ecological crisis. Now that we know as what we call the theory of metabolic rift, because he perceived history and nature to be one, as being intrinsically connected with each other. Uh, it is in the German ideology, Marx and Engels wrote that we know only one science, and the lines are there on your slide. And it says, we know that there is only one science, the science of history, and history can be viewed from two sides. It can be divided into the history of nature and the history of man. And the two sides, however, are not seen to be as independent entities, as separate entities, but they say that as long as man has existed, nature and man have affected each other. So one can easily see that Marx's what we call his dialectical materialism, or what we call historical materialism, is deeply embedded in concerns about environment, concerns about nature. In fact, it wouldn't be wrong to say that Marx's historical materialism is also it sort of it includes ecological materialism as well. So, um, the emergence of, in recent years, the emergence of Marxist ecological theories in culture and literary studies, which again is interdisciplinary, it sort of demonstrates the relevance of Marx's dialectical theory of dialectical materialism. And what Marx's material history does is to give us a methodological tool, a specific way to study the exchange between humans and nature as a mode of production and their larger impact upon society and culture. So the aim of Marxist ecological theorists, however, is not to how do I put it? Is not to really Marxize. Um, yeah, allowed me this rather ugly verb. It's not to Marxize ecology, but maybe to ecologize Marxism. And in recent years, uh, prominent Marxist ecological critics, and some of them I would be mentioning, like Imre Zeman and Stephanie Lemenegger and Frederick Buell, in their work on they've done a lot of work, good work, fascinating studies on hydrocarbon societies, where they focus on the way in which the saturation of our culture and aesthetics is actually driven by the energy of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. So, in their cultural analysis, what they have reread and reinterpreted a wide range of literary texts, ranging from the writings of Dickens and Conrad to Steinbeck and Amitav Ghosh, where the predominant trope has been some energy source or the other. And this itself makes it a very fascinating intervention into the field of culture studies. So if you ask me, what do Marxist ecologist theories do in the interpretation of culture or in the rereading of literary writings, then, well, we might say that they do the following things. One is that they sort of map the specific encounters between literary cultural forms, aesthetics, and postmodern politics or petromodern politics. They also uncover the slippery and often viscous connections that fossil fuels have with wage labor and capital. And as is evident from the bullet points in the slide, the point is that that behind these interventions that Marxist ecological critics do in the study of hydrocarbon societies, it is the acceptance or the underlying the underlying premise seems to be that oil is the ore commodity. It is the ore commodity in our post-industrial and hydrocarbon modernity. And so Marx's critique of capitalism and its intersection with contemporary ecological theory provides a very definitive framework for us to examine the infusion of oil into our culture, which includes, of course, literature. This is, again, a very fascinating work, History of Oil Cultures by Frederick Buell. And in this text, in this work, Buell considers, what he calls the dialectics of fuel as, and by that he means, the interplay between two types of culture. He defines that the dialectics of oil or the dialectics of fuel is is a combination of the overriding tensions and conflict between two kinds of culture. One he calls as material culture, and the second he calls as symbolic culture, both of which, according to him, modify a society's concept of the individual and the environment. So material culture, according to Buell, denotes the transformation brought about by, let us say, the oil industry or the petrochemical industry, while symbolic culture refers to the representations of this hydrocarbon reality in different forms of art and literature. Whether it is films, whether it is fiction, or whether it is documentaries, or whether it is even poster art. So Buell conceives, in fact, history as a succession of what he calls energy systems. A concept that obviously he derives from Marx's mode of production, and which he believes, are constituted. These energy systems, he says, are constituted by socio-cultural, economic, environmental, and technological relationships. So he makes this fascinating argument that these energy systems, societies in different epochs, in different eras, can be looked at as energy systems, and these energy systems or energy-driven societies have been characterized by the dominance of a particular source of energy, such as coal, gas, petroleum, or oil, in a particular point in history. And these have impacted the predominant energy form in a particular society has impacted our modes of being, the modes of being and imagining of people living in those conditions. It is a fact that oil's investment, therefore, in the way in which we live our lives today, has become so overwhelming that it has led to the growth of, as I said, petroculture. However, and this is the great enigma, this is the paradox, that what is very surprising is that despite oil's permeability, its infusion into our life, it has found very little corresponding expression in cultural modes, whether it is fiction, or whether it is fiction films, up until now. In fact, oil's the discourse around oil, the discourse surrounding oil, has been limited to techno-industrial circles and to green debates over an imperiled ecology. But it has had no narrative presence, no significant narrative present in any kind of mainstream literary writing till the 1980s. If one actually looks to find out oil's visibility in mainstream fiction, then it's rather surprising that despite its infusion, its complete immersion in the way in which we live our lives, in the way in which we produce and consume our cultures, that oil has had no narrative presence in sort of mainstream literary writings, other than, of course, a rare exception like this American writer named Upton Sinclair, who wrote a novel bearing the same name, that is Oil, and which was published in 1927. And here is therefore the paradox, or rather, here is this intriguing puzzle that, compared to what we call great themes of literature, wars, partition, natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, and famines, energy has played a rather muted role in the field of literary studies. In recent decades, however, it has gained considerable traction as a cultural capital, and has become an important trope in cultural narratives. So, oil or oil-driven or energy-driven sources are finding more and more cultural expressions in many narrative modes, whether it is fiction, whether it is non-fiction, films, documentaries, or other art forms such as installation art, for instance. So, fiction writers, particularly, have found in the power and diffusion of oil a rich vein, a rich source of themes, tropes, and symbols, and many modern writers have in fact mined the an entire protocol of themes, images, and technique, and also evolved techniques in order to write a particular kind of fiction that we may call petrofiction. So one could say that the trickle of oil has spilled over to literary writing, spawning a new kind of genre called petrofiction. And this brings me to the question of the history of the term petrofiction itself. Do let me know if my slides are moving.
Yes, sir, it is.
Right. Well, it's of course, Amitav Ghosh who coined the term petrofiction. In an essay called Petrofiction, the oil encounter and the novel, he was reviewing a novel called Cities of Salt, written by a Saudi Arabian writer named Abdul Rahman Munif. And this essay, published almost a quarter, a quarter and century ago, published in 1992, was titled Petrofiction: The Oil Encounter and the Novel. So, what is the essay about? What Ghosh, in this essay, Ghosh famously laments that the lack of fiction. He finds that there is a lack of fiction which addresses oil and what he terms the oil encounter, particularly with reference to American fiction. A lack of interest, according to him, which is shown by American novelists in engaging with the historical intertwining of the fates of Americans and the peoples of the Middle East over this resource. Now, this might seem to be an outrageous argument, but actually, when you think of, we teach American literature as well in our PG courses, and so the minute we think about American literature or modern American fiction, we talk about the great American dream, and which is one of the archetypal tropes that we find in all kinds of whether it is the American novel or American poetry. one of the things that if we dig deeper, if we explore a bit deeper, is that when we talk about the American dream was a was a was a stood like a cultural metaphor, or it indicated a sort of a lifestyle which is impossible to imagine other than its centrality, because it depended centrally on automobility, a certain automobility, a certain its very notion of individualism and a self-sufficient, the idea of a self-sufficient family. All of these are in fact inseparable from the influence of petrol, or from the influence of the narratives of the materiality, as well as the narratives of the petro industry that came into being in the 40s and the 50s. There was an explosion of oil surplus in American society uh, post World War. So oil, therefore, was very much was the defining feature of American culture, and it sort of fueled the very notion of the great American dream. And what Amitav Ghosh therefore points out is that despite the fact that, despite oil's permeability, therefore, its huge influence in shaping and defining the American mode of being, it did not surprisingly find imaginative expressions. It was not engaged and taken up by American writers throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So he asks this very fascinating question that that if there is so much of oil in American life, then uh, when there is so much to write about, as the slide tells you, there's a quote from the essay, that if there is so much to write about, why has this encounter proved to be, the oil encounter has proved to be so imaginatively sterile? And Ghosh offers multiple reasons. But among the several reasons, we don't have the time to go into the detail of what he says. But the most important reason that he unearths to show the dearth of fiction, to explain the dearth of fiction, particularly American fiction, in addressing the impact of oil, is what he calls, he says, just a minute, I have the full quote that is given on the slide. Let me quote. Yeah. He says, to a great many Americans, oil smells bad. It reeks of unavoidable overseas entanglement, a worrisome foreign dependency, economic uncertainty, risky and expensive military enterprises, of thousands of dead civilians and children, and all the troublesome questions that lie buried in their graves. And to make things still worse, it begins to smell of pollution and environmental hazards. It reeks, it stinks, it becomes a problem that can be written about only in the language of solution. So this is the entire quote, part of which you find on your slide. So the point here really is that in the essay, Ghosh establishes a sort of a historical parallel, between the spice trade of the 18th and the 19th centuries and the oil trade of the 20th century. And what he finds similar between spice and oil is their strategic and economic value, and the extent of their political, social, and cultural impact in far-flung places. But with one difference, and this is again very important, with one difference, as he says, that whereas the spice trade beginning from in the 18th and 19th century sort of spawned, and it inspired a rich body of literature of European writings, including the Lusades going back to 16th century, to perhaps even Amitav Ghosh's most recent book that you see on your slide, the nutmeg core, the nutmeg curse, which again explores, it sort of unearths the hidden roots of colonial trade, which impacted and even destroyed the indigenous culture of the Java Islands, which was which was rich in nutmeg. So what he finds is that that whereas the spice trade, of the 18th and 19th centuries is reflected, it finds its presence both in terms of theme, in terms of subject, in terms of subject engagement in European writings. This has not happened with the discovery of oil has not seen a similar manifestation it has had very little literary output. So, as Ghosh says, it is as if, the history of oil, Ghosh says, is a matter of embarrassment, verging on the unspeakable, the pornographic. So, Ghosh's standpoint may remind us in a sort of inverted way of the critical stance of the Marxist political theorist such as Frederick Jameson. I mean, I'm talking of Frederick Jameson, who in his book, The Political Unconscious, argues that 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 narrative is central to our understanding of reality. All narratives, as this text, the book Political Unconscious says, that all narrative must be read for their connections with the concrete material realities that is outside, uh, which James, of course, calls this approach that he calls to literature and culture, investigating the intricate relationship between material resources, the material reality, and the shaping of culture, is what he calls dialectical criticism. So, in the case of the lack of narration of oil encounter in contemporary fiction, one may argue that, Jameson, the famous term that he uses, Jameson's political unconsciousness is reflected in the deliberate concealment, what I would call in the deliberate concealment of oil's cultural pervasiveness. I mean, as a the sort of social and political anxieties that are generated in a post-industrial society about oil are, I argue, are perversely made inexpressible in any form of narration, including the novel. It is as if the very slipperiness of oil, or as if the very nature and form, its sort of viscous fluidity, sort of challenges and defies its cultural representation. And so, in this, um, you know, what Ghosh argued in that 1992 essay on where he used the word petrofiction for the first time, he has carried that narrative to examine the nature of our material resources and its impact on environment degradation. Also, in a book that we all perhaps have read called The Great Derangement, and where Ghosh again explores, or rather deplores our inability at the level of life, at the level of history, at the level of literature and politics, to grasp the scale and violence of climate change caused by our carbon economy. So if one were to map, if one were to map the visibility or invisibility of oil or energy and its impact upon society and environment, then one would say that from the great acceleration, what used to be called as the great acceleration of the 1950s and 60s, where more and more rich oil reserves were found across the world, and suddenly it's sort of much like the Victorian optimism on unbridled progress and growth. Suddenly there was this euphoria about this uh, new about the abundance of this new resource called the black gold, and therefore it was appropriately called black gold. So from that great acceleration, where the abundance of oil resources sort of energized and accelerated the process of industrial growth and world over the progress of humanity. One would say that one can map the trajectory of this intersection between energy and culture from the great acceleration of the 1950s and 60s to the increasing to what Ghosh calls the great derangement in the 90s and into the 21st century. Clearly, where the earlier euphoria, the earlier optimism and euphoria about oil, about the use of these energy resources that promise so much of growth, has unfortunately had its debilitating effect upon environment and leading to climate warming, global warming. Uh, so, uh, so Ghosh is, Ghosh himself again. Now, many of us who teach Ghosh, who have researched on Ghosh, uh, Ghosh himself has not been silent on oil. I mean, as a writer, I mean, in the Circle of Reason, one of his early books, he provides a critique of oil capitalism, of global oil capitalism, and an aspect that is not really seldom explored in critical interpretations of the novel. You see, while oil, yes, oil is not central to the plot yet. If one examines the novel, one reads the novel from an energy perspective, then it's not difficult to find that the thematic and structural motors of the novel are fueled by oil, especially in the second section titled Rajas Passion, because it is in this section that Ghosh takes the story to a fictional oil emirate called Al Ghazira, somewhere in the Middle East, and shows how the shenanigans of a U.S. oil company destroys the life and culture of the local populace. So apart from being a scathing indictment of oil capitalism, Ghosh's novel um, may also highlights, yeah, and this is again what comes out when we read literature from an energy perspective, because it does highlight even the misery and sufferings of migrant laborers from Asia to provide cheap labor to migrant laborers who work in oil rigs and oil refineries in the Gulf, and leading therefore to the large scale migration, or you could say displacement, what one would call an example of what I would call petro diaspora. So the circle of reason therefore may be regarded as an example of petrofiction, one that invites a detailed petro reinterpretation. So to repeat my point, the kind of the lack of oil fiction that sort of Ghosh laments more than 25 years, lamented 25 years ago, has is increasingly now finding a literary riposte. The intersection of oil capitalism, oil capitalism, and oil politics has drawn the attention of a number of writers across the globe, especially from those places which we call the hotspots of oil extraction and politics. Um, uh, yeah, what you see on your slide are examples, a selection of what I call the burning titles. Uh, petrofiction writers have emerged in the last couple of, the last 2 decades, in fact, last 2 or 3 decades, and one who have engaged themselves in their narratives with the impact of oil on culture, on society, and the environment. Nigerian, for example, the first one on your slide, Oil on Water. I mean, this is a book written by the Nigerian author uh, Helen Habila, and it's one of the foremost examples of fiction taking head on the terrible consequences of the oil encounter, which in his country, oil was discovered in the 50s, 1950s. And so the narrative, the story, the novel tells us what happens when a multinational oil company joins hands with a corrupt local government to extract oil with complete disregard to the people and the environment. The second book that you see on your slide is Cities of Salt. Cities of Salt. This again is a quintet series. In fact, it's a series of books. It's a series of 5 novels written by the Saudi Arabian novelist Abdul Rahman Munif. It was originally written in Arabic, but then translated. Not all the books are translated. I think three of the 5 books are translated. But again, Cities of Salt, the one that Amitav Ghosh uh, reviewed in that 1992 essay. Uh, what we witness again in this novel is the first encounter of an American oil company with a local Bedouin population, and what happens. It leads to the subsequent uprooting and displacement of an indigenous tribe who, before the sort of contact with the multinational company were living in harmony with their environment, with the land and with their environment. Texaco and Greenbow are also examples. This is just a representative selection. I mean, if you were to Google petrofiction, any young researcher wanting to enter into the interdisciplinary study of petrofiction or energy humanities, if you were to Google petrofiction, then you would find any number, a good 15 to 20 novels that have been written in recent years. The point, therefore, is that oil, which was rather invisible, in in literary in the literary output throughout the throughout the 20th century, is finding more and more visibility in contemporary fiction. And what you see, therefore, on the slide are some prominent are some writers who have been dealing with um oil and its engagement in their narratives. So, what is, these examples of petrofiction that have emerged from different parts of the world sort of constitute a literary subgenre that we have already called petrofiction, but one which I find has a specific aim now. You know, these writings, disparate writings written coming from different locations, show a shared concern of oil's impact on society, culture, and environment. And therefore, you know, uh, therefore, if you ask me, how do we define petrofiction? If petrofiction has now evolved into a corpus, a substantial body of work, then what are some of the distinctive features that we find in petronarratives? So these are self-explanatory. I need not explain these bullet points to you. They are self-evident. But what you can see is that the critical inquiry into petrofiction yields so many deep points, complex points of intervention. Makes petrofiction a very, very fascinating body of writings to approach from, whether you are approaching it from ecology or whether you are taking, in fact, the intersection of ecology with Marxism, or for that matter, even post-colonial criticism. Um, so the visibility of oil and the impact of hydrocarbon culture is shown not only in fiction, but it's a sign, a symptom of its increasing visibility seen also in popular culture. And the production of petroculture in recent times has spawned a range of narratives right from um, uh, science fiction to experimental fiction to installation art. So, so what this means really is, as Imre Zeman, the energy humanist critic, says, is that, and I quote here, what he says is that the outpouring of engagement of oil in different modes of culture and literature shows that, and I quote, he says, any and all examples of cultural expression in the era of oil has to be seen as crucially figured by its material, metaphorical, and social relations. So so right from, I wonder whether when I was growing up, I read this comic book about Tintin. Now, the Tintin series, Land of Black Gold, by the very famous Belgian artist and comic writer Berger. And even in comics, therefore, it isn't as if energy has, or oil specifically has not been tackled. It's not there as an important theme, but you can see that even in a Tintin comic, such as The Land of Black Gold, sort of places which takes us where the whole story revolves around an oil-rich city somewhere in the Middle East, which is taken over by European oil diggers. What happens then? Uh, this the oil narratives has also led to political criticism like Ezra Levin's a very famous work called Ethical Oil, the ethics of oil, in fact, the ethics of hydrocarbon energy and its impact on society. That has been examined by in a very famous groundbreaking work called Ethical Oil by Ezra Levin. What you see on the top slide is, in fact, what we call uh, oil activism. Visual oil activism. This is an art installation by a pair of French artists called, it's called the London Mastaba. The art installation is called the London Mastaba, and it's basically the kind of pyramid shape. The pyramid shape that you see is installed by putting together a number of oil barrels, painted, of course, and they call it the London Mastaba, and it's placed in a lake near Hyde Park in London. Uh, all of these narratives, whether it is in graphic fiction, whether it is in comic book or oil installation, the bottom images that you see, for example, is a photography, is the is the photograph, the middle picture against the backdrop of oil burning and the camels there, is a series of photographs done um, by Edward Butinsky. So the point really is that yes, the oil is becoming more and more visible in different forms of cultural narratives, not just literature. And these are what perhaps Lawrence Buell calls toxic discourses. Toxic discourses where any is a sort of narrative that exposes our anxiety, that an anxiety or a concern that arises from a perceived threat to environment, sort of an environmental hazard. So it obviously, this visibility or this intersection between oil, environment, culture, and society leads us to ask of what use is petrofriction. And I think one energy humanist critic, I find this particular quote uh, making a very important position, stating a very important position. This is by Graham MacDonald, and the book is The Resources of Culture. And he says, and I quote what is there on your slide. He says, fiction in its various modes, genres, and histories offer a significant and relatively untapped repository for the energy-aware scholar to demonstrate how, through successive epochs, particularly embedded kinds of energy create a predominant and oftentimes alternative culture of being and imagining in the world, organizing and enabling a prevalent mode of living, thinking, moving, dwelling, and working. So, so petrofiction, friends, one may argue, um, is a genre that kind of keeps the eco-critical discourse alive. I mean, in interrogating the many issues related to oil, its colonial past, its new colonial present, the greed and machinations of mega oil companies, the destruction of local societies, the displacement or forced migration of labor, uh, particularly from Africa and South Asia. Um, its exploitation, the exploitation of the oil companies of natural and human resources, all of these sort of enables petrofiction. It sort of energizes an ecological and Marxist interpretation of oil's effect on uh, on these many things, and it basically asks us to discover the processes by which, embedded narratives of energy have created. How have they created dominant and sometimes alternative counter narratives or counter cultures of being and meaning in the world? So, uh, in the least, energy-driven interpretations of rereading literature, or reinterpreting cultural forms, what it does is it sort of helps us to pose the right questions. It sort of it enriches our understanding of what petro narratives are doing. For example, um, does literature, does literature shape and shift in accordance with the dominant energy form of the era it registers? Might energy somehow play a role in reproducing or even resisting a predominant energy culture? To do literature, to invest, to interrogate literature and culture from the energy perspective is to ask, what happens if we sort texts, if we classify texts according to the energy sources that made them possible. So what happens if we reach our literary periods, literary periods like 18th century and 19th century literature, or when we kind of we teach we teach our history of literature in terms of movements, romanticism, classicism, modernism, postmodernism. What if we were to sort of go back to the history of literature and sort of rewrite it, or relook it from the point of view of its bearing, the bearing of energy, the bearing of the dominant source of energy on the literary output of a particular decade? So what happens if we reach out literary periods and make energy source as a matter of urgency to literary criticism? So it's like, can we think, for example, of modernism outside an oil electric context, or can we think of realism without coal, without steam? Can we think of romanticism without wind or water? Is it possible to think of literature without thinking about the ages of wood, tallow, coal, gasoline, or any other fossil fuel, or even alternative fuel sources? Well, the answer would be not really, because in each of the ages, the production of culture, including the type of fiction, has been greatly influenced by the type of energy that has been extracted and that has been consumed. I mean, pause for a minute. Think of Dickens. Think of Dickens in 19th century Victorian age. How is it even possible to read Dickens and 19th century Victorian age without thinking of soot and tallow candles? Um, how is it possible to read Lawrence without thinking of coal mining and collieries? How is it possible to think of modern literature without thinking of Cormac McCarthy's, a novel such as Cormac McCarthy's The Road? Um, those of you who have read would remember. I mean, it's an apocalyptic. It is a story that places the world it's in a post-apocalyptic world where the last survivors, everything else has been destroyed because of pollution and environmental change, except for the last survivors of father and son, and who are shown to trudge on this absolutely nightmarish landscape. They are walking. The entire narrative shows them moving from one devastated city to another devastated city on a bitumen shattered highway, ironically using an oil company's map as a guide. So when we look at these are some of among the many questions when we read literature, when we read energy narratives from the point of view of both ecology and Marx. Um, like I said, one of the most searing texts written on oil exploitation and its devastating effects that has come up in recent times is by this Nigerian writer, Helen Habila. It's as recent as 2010. And, from the title to the last scenes of the novel, oil presents, or rather Habila presents oil as something that affects the mood, environment, and atmosphere. He sort of The entire landscape in the novel is a rather forbidding and menacing petrosphere. And what the story is, to put it in a nutshell, what the story is, it tells this. It's about the kidnapping of a white woman in Nigeria who happens to be who is the wife of a British oil corporation executed by local militants who demand a huge ransom to free her. And and this is their way. This is their way of making the oil company pay for what they believe is fair compensation for the destruction of local lives and livelihoods by what they think is the greed and rapacity of American oil of the American oil company. So reading Habila's story from an energy point of view sharply brings forth the terrible impact that oil extraction has had on the local environment and its carnage on the rich wild and including marine life in the Nigerian delta. This is an example of what Patricia Lemenega calls, the resource curse. She calls this is an example of a novel which sort of deals with what one would call a resource curse. The resource curse meaning, the tradition where an oil rich places which are abundant in the reserves of oil uh, are also the ones which are steeped in abject poverty due to the extraction and exploitation of multinational companies. So to find resource curse in a novel such as Habila's Oil on Water is to look at the problem of plenty, or to look at what is called the paradox of poverty, where mineral rich places in the global south are in fact the ones that are the most underdeveloped, and which again shows to you the continuity of colonialism and imperialism in new guises. So um, let's see how we are doing with time. Um, in this is the second novel, whereas Oil on Water is an attempt to produce, it sort of tries to produce an ecological voice, the goal of which is to decenter the human subject, and in order to give more weightage to the ecological object. Um, in contrast to that, Cities of Salt, written in 1984 by Abdul Rahman Munif, works behind the scenes. I mean, oil is not very, it's not visible in a very direct way in the novel, and yet when it can be looked at it must be read as an oil narrative. Cities of Salt was first published in Arabic and then appeared in English translation in 1987. And interestingly enough, Abdul Rahman Munif himself was an oil engineer and an economist, and in his many interviews, he says that when he talks about oil and especially its impact upon Saudi Arabia, he looks at the uh, you know the, the richness of oil reserves in Saudi Arabia as a sort of a lost opportunity for Saudi Arabia for the development of the Arab world itself. And he says that underdeveloped countries, wherever oil has been found in rich reserves, in fact, oil has become a damnation because it has sort of attracted the greed and corruption of multinational companies as well as the local governments. So also international politics in combination with capitalist greed, has also led to the destruction of the environment of these particular places. So this is a novel where, again, the main story is about how a U.S. oil company discovers land occupied by the Bedouin community actually is sitting atop a large deposit of oil, and how the oil company officials, they force the Bedouins to abandon their traditional way of life and leave their own homes. So the local population themselves are forced to migrate, and those who remain are compelled to work for cheap labor. So here is an example, two examples that I've given you of what I would call representative examples of fiction. However, with a difference that while Cities of Salt sort of gently maps the transition from a traditional social formation to a colonial capitalist society, Oil on Water shows just how terrible the future will be when when this kind of a society, becomes more and more dependent upon oil. So, Cities of Salt, in a sense, emphasizes wasted possibility, while Oil on Water describes the utter exhaustion of physical and social landscapes, which are birthed by a by petro economy. The last example that I would give of an energy narrative or a petro narrative is this short story titled "The Petrol Pump." It's not a novel; it's a short story called "The Petrol Pump," written the very by the very famous postmodern and magic realist writer Italo Calvino. And the story, although written, I mean, the story was written way back in 1974, but it is sort of very prophetic. It's frighteningly, it is both frighteningly realistic and both prophetic in the way in which Calvino sort of captures the stress and anxiety of a society caught in the grips of peak oil crisis. And the story begins with this with a opening line which says, um, I should have thought of it before it's too late now. That's the very first line of the story. I should have thought of it before, but it's too late now. And this opening sentence of Calvino's "The Petrol Pump" sort of echoes a guilt. It's a kind of guilt-ridden. It resonates the guilt-ridden sentiment that most of us suffer from, living as we do in an age where this whose zeitgeist is fueled by a sort of an energy angst that we all suffer from. So uh, the what does the character, when the character thinks what do I do next, he's actually thinking about whether to fuel his car or not to fuel his car, uh, uh, even as the petrol pump stations are fast closing because there is a shortage of oil. So the character's initial dilemma, to fill or not to fill, uh, is sort of develops in the story. It mutates into a sort of anguished meditation on modernity itself, a modernity which obviously is fueled by oil. And the narrator in the story flays himself when he recognizes that he too, like most of us, has slipped into what Calvino calls a gasoline junkiedom. The narrator, the character, the narrator feels guilty for being a gasoholic, for using so much of petrol, for you know, for visiting the petrol pump and tanking up his car so often, and for not having thought about how he and others are guilty of using up one of Earth's finite resources. And so, what you see on the slide is his own thinking, his what he's telling in his mind. He says the gauge has been warning me for quite a while that the tank is in reserve. They have been warning us for quite a while that underground global resources can't last more than 20 years or so. So I've had plenty of time to think about it. As usual, I have been irresponsible. So, like the narrator, are we also irresponsible? Um, the point about the story, or shall we say, the ironic emission of Calvino's story, is that it troubles us. It troubles us because it once again puts the same question in our mind. What do we do? The question, what do we do once our cars have stalled and petrol pumps have run dry? And it sort of connects. I'm connecting it with the documentary "The Crude Awakening," which I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. So, what do we do once cars cannot bolt out of petrol stations because there is no more fuel? So, one could one may read Calvino's story or the empty gas station in Calvino's story as a sort of a metaphor, a premonitory metaphor for our current resource anxiety. And this powerful effect of Calvino's story comes through, from the conflict between the characters' nascent, what one might call petro-conscience, and the logic and the irrefutable logic of a petrol-driven capitalism that drives us to consume oil, even though we are aware that we are leaving that we are causing carbon emission in our atmosphere. So this story, like many other petro narratives, sort of brings to the fore the public consumption of oil, the privatization of guilt, uh, and the convenient dismissal of a green ethical thinking. So, what are the conclusions that we might draw from this rather hurried investigation into what we call the narratives of petrofiction? Is oil cultural? Does it represent the cultural logic of late fossil capital? I would say yes, it does, because as Frederick Buell says, he says that energy history, the history of energy, is inextricably entwined with the history of culture. And you see, today when we talk about hydrocarbon narratives, to look at narratives in a new energy in a new energy light is to give traction to issues such as resource exploitation, market capitalism, human displacement, species extinction, all those things that we do under, as eco-criticism, climate change, fossil fuel, etc., global warming. And I think there is a need for to re-examine our own cultural modes, uh, and to bring forth, to make visible the way in which petroleum and energy are embedded. They may not be obviously visible, but they are embedded in these cultural narratives. In a sense, what I'm trying to say is that we need more, people like Greta Thunberg to launch to launch school strikes for climate and planet, and more writers like Habila to stop and undo our wanton destruction of the environment. So the texts that I have examined, given you as examples, are show what Frederick Bull calls, he describes our oil society, a contemporary oil society, as an what he calls exuberant catastrophe. And novels such as Havila's Oil on Water, stories such as Calvino's The Petrol Pump, they sort of unearth, they reveal the real but hidden stories of oil, what Amitav Ghosh calls an embarrassing history. So petrofiction demonstrates that the human guzzling of a finite resource such as oil cannot go on endlessly. It sort of warns us of a future without fuel, if checks and balances are not installed immediately. So to go back to that question, why should we read oil fiction? If you ask me, well, because oil matters and because our planet matters. To ask what is petrofiction's role in our market-driven modernity, oil modernity, is like asking what role did novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin or To Kill a Mockingbird play in battling against racism? So the answer, therefore, is as I, as is given in by Buell, who argues that energy history is connected with cultural history. And so the aim of petroculture or hydrocarbon culture, it's our investigation of hydrocarbon culture, is to claim a space for critical literary and artistic discourse engagement. So because the critical discourse on oil has been largely limited to the treatment of oil as a geopolitical and corporate and corporate substance measured and valued in terms of petrodollars. But oil's power needs aesthetic representation. It needs more and more writers to sort of look at the possibility of bringing forth oil's invisibility, of making visible oil's invisibility. So, fiction, therefore, the engagement of fiction as well as non-fiction with oil, I believe, will be crucial in the future, in not only exposing the sort of corporate fetishization of oil, but also in adding pitch, pit, and tar to green voices that tell us our planet matters and therefore oil matters. These are, I thought I'll share with you some of the important texts, some of the important works that are considered foundational in the field of interdisciplinary studies, what we call energy humanities. And these are also the works that I have studied and researched. I have been studying and researching on. So thank you so much, and I'll take any questions or comments or observations.
Thank you, Dr. Pantik Banerjee, for your intellectually stimulating chapter the topic, and also for taking time to expound your mesmerizing ideas regarding petrofiction, petroculture, ecological Marxism, dialectics of fuel, petro-diaspora, and various other relevant topics within the text. I personally resonated with this keynote for the fact that my childhood was basically made in the Middle East, and I could actually relate to a lot of aspects of petrofiction, as you know, the Middle East is the pioneer and the benefactors of the hydrocarbon economy, and is also, so in your own words, put it, a combustible area for the writers like Abdul Rahman Munif from Saudi Arabia. Also, at this juncture, I would like for the audiences to pose questions to the keynote speaker.
Seems like there is an exhaustion of energy, academic energy. Well, it
Yes,
doesn't
I
really
think.
matter. If my suggestion would be that if and when participants have any kind of queries, uh, I I have posted. They can address their queries. They can mail or WhatsApp me.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. I hope they would do that. I also have some. I found your, as I said earlier, sir, I found your uh, keynote very riveting, considering the fact about its relativity to me since I was born in the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia, country of Saudi Arabia. Petrofiction was not something which I actually came to know until a very recent time, and I found it to be a very riveting area of study, especially in the recent time. So, what
Are you
advice
doing your?
do you have? No,
Yeah.
sir, I'm not doing current, but as I said, I have a small interest and a proclivity to the area, considering that it has a lot of aspects of my childhood in it as well. Because when you live in as you said, when you live in an environment built on a hydrocarbon economy, it actually affects the entire ecosystem as well, especially with relatives to the tribes, the Bedouin tribes who had to be displaced for the upcoming developments. And one very important aspect, sir, that you talked about was the vacuity of speech, especially in the petrofiction narratives, which is very important because none of those petrofiction stories are actually being told are very popular. And so I have this one question to pose to you, sir. So do you find that the petrofiction narratives, the relevance of petrofiction narratives, especially at the considering the fact that we have reached COP26, where we are trying to cut down emissions and many other factors. So, what do you find the relevance of a petrofiction narrative, especially in the post-oil era, which is something that even the global oil economies are also focusing on, that is diversifying from oil. So, your thoughts on
Um,
this?
thank you, Rohit, and if I may call you Rohit, and yeah, one of the important things by which we can connect our oil narratives, or even the discourse on energy, is to link it to the failure of the recently held Glasgow summit on climate change. And in recent history, the failure of climate change, or the Paris Climate Agreement, and the failure of the Glasgow meet points out again to the undeniable fact that that when we are talking about saving the planet Earth, most of the political wisdom seems to be lacking. Why? Because after all, the minute we talk about reduction of carbon emission, and to come, we are looking at a dichotomy between the developed countries, the industrial rich countries of the global north, and the developing countries in the global south. And this is the central paradox about energy and environment. On the one hand, the what we used to call the underdeveloped or developing countries of the 50s and the 60s, and India was one of them. um, in order to play catch up, with let's say the United States, in order to play catch up, all underdeveloped or developing economies so were forced or compelled to explore the possibility of energy extraction and energy resources. But on the other hand, down the years, it's been 80 years or 90 years, down the ages also, there is the more our political economy or industrial economies are dependent upon oil and its supplementary products, the more damage we are doing to our environment. uh, there seems to be the geopolitics of present times seems to suggest that countries like America, France, and Canada, who still are who are the major consumers of oil, seem to not believe seem to believe that it's not their responsibility. There is a sort of privilege that they hold, that, well, now the responsibility of cutting down carbon emissions, of cutting down petro fuel driven economies, lies on countries such as India. And therein lies the paradox. I mean, if you want to move ahead and be as have consumerist lifestyles as good as the ones in the West, then it obviously means that it increases our dependency. There is a surplus on the surplus of oil. On the other hand, there is also the mitigating factor of environmental damage, of climate change and global warming, that will be its fallout, the negative fallout. So this is the paradox of energy-driven economies, and it's something that one can't shy away from. However, as I said, the failure of the Paris summit, as well as the recent Glasgow summit, suggests that there is no political wisdom, because after all, the impact of globalization and industrial capitalism is still fuel driven. And so long as we think of short-term benefits, short-term advantages, this is how the world will be. So when planet matters is also to consider oil matters. And because oil matters, I think we need to be far more careful and cautious in look at, for example, only day before I was reading in the papers about how from a sedan driven economy, we are now we are becoming increasingly an SUV driven economy. Now, what does that mean? While it shows, for example, that our per capita income, it shows the middle class, it seems to suggest that in spite of the being hit by the pandemic, we seem to have more per capita income and salaries and packages to buy higher models of cars. But the flip side is that SUVs are gas guzzling engines. So while everyone is lining up and booking up SUVs, right, well, it's the car companies that are smiling all the way, happily laughing all the way to the bank. But what about the environmental cost? What about the carbon footprint that we are leaving behind? So political economy, the narrative of political economy is a fuel-driven economy. And so perhaps what needs to be done is to rewrite something that Arthur Haley wrote way back in the 1970s. Arthur Haley, the very, very famous pulp fiction writer, he wrote a novel, a best-selling novel that I read in school, called Wheels, which is about the automobile industry in Detroit. So perhaps somebody like you, Rohit, should take up and write write a novel about your own Middle East experiences to make visible these petro narratives and their devastating impact.
Sure, sir. I'll fulminate on the same regarding.
Chitra ma'am is from
thank
Bhutan.
You for answering my question.
No, I was just
Yeah,
about
I
to
would
say,
like to contribute from a positive note, from a carbon neutral location.
exactly. I was about to say that. Bhutan again is, as Chitra ma'am says, is a carbon neutral, which means that even now, if you visit Bhutan, you won't find too many vehicles on there. And even if they are, I mean, the mode of transport, carpool, for instance, is something that we have not really worked upon. And there are no driveway lanes. There are specific lanes and zones in Bhutan where you cannot park, where you cannot bring your vehicles. So look at can such a thing be done in India? Well, not really. When shopping malls are in the center of the city, when shopping malls are in the center of the city, and shopping malls bring forth our consumerist lifestyle. So in order to go to the shopping mall, well, we need our cars. So it's a vicious cycle, actually. And a viscous one is there.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I would like to leave the platform for further questions. If any participant have any further questions.
How many sessions do you have after this?
So I think we have another session.
And what time? What time is the next session?
Next session is about around 2:30.
2:30.
So I think the participants can energize themselves by having a sumptuous lunch and two back
Yes, sir.
two back-to-back keynote addresses seem to have exhausted people.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. So, once again, sir, I would like to thank you, and also my institution, Bharata College, for allowing me to capitalize on this opportunity to offer you the vote of thanks for this keynote session. I hope it has been a wonderful experience for you, sir, because definitely it was for us listening to your keynote, very pedantic keynote on the not very well illuminated topic of petrofiction, and I hope it gains traction in the literary research